Death has again come to claim one of Kalamazoo's best-known and respected citizens. Mrs. Frank Henderson, wife of the late Frank Henderson, died at 1:30 this Friday morning at the palatial home on West Main Street after a critical illness of about 7 weeks. Mrs. Henderson had been very low for the past few days, but it was not until Thursday morning that the members of the family realized that the end was very near. She died as she had lived, a faithful Christian woman, and her benevolence and kindness will stamp her name on many a heart. For the past year Mrs. Henderson had not been in good health. Last February she accompanied her sister, Mrs. Helen Cobb, to Florida, thinking that the change in climate would be beneficent. She returned home and grew rapidly worse. She bore the long illness with remarkable strength and patience. Wednesday she was apparently at the point of death, but rallied. The family were constantly near and Thursday morning were called to the bedside to bid the dying mother a last farewell. The Lord's Prayer was recited and a psalm was sung. During the remainder of the time the deceased rallied at different times from an unconscious state. Thursday evening she rested well, but when the end came she was exhausted by the long struggle. Mrs. Mary Henderson was born in Kalamazoo in 1846. She was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Taylor, one of the city's most respected pioneer families. They were natives of Scotland and owned the old Taylor homestead at 215 East South Street. Mrs. Henderson received her early education in the famous school conducted by Mrs. Lucinda H. Stone. Later she attended Brown Seminary for Young Ladles at Auburn, New York. In May, 1868, she was married to Frank Henderson, one of Kalamazoo's well-known businessmen. For many years the couple lived at 202 East South Street. Of the 6 children born to them 5 are now living. They are, Mrs. Alexander Wetmore, of Detroit, and Mrs. John Wheeler, Mrs. J. B. Keyes and Mrs. Robert Supple of Kalamazoo, and James E. Henderson of Kalamazoo. Mr. Henderson died 8 years ago. Mrs. Helen Cobb of this city, a sister, is the only surviving member of the Taylor family. Aside from her many other activities, Mrs. Henderson was a director of the Ladles Aid Society of the First Presbyterian Church, a director of the Ladles Library Association, and a member of the governing board of the Children's Home. Until recently she was vice president of the Humane Society. The funeral will be held at 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon at the home in Henderson Park, West Main Street. Tribute by Dr. H. W. Gelston. In the death of Mrs. Henderson this community has suffered a loss that will be felt widely and deeply. She has long been associated with many and varied forms of private and public service. Without neglecting home duties she has always found time for acts of benevolence that were wide-reaching and helpful in the highest degree. Possessed of a natural power of leadership, her counsel has been sought and followed by others who have found her wisdom practical and efficient. Her service has been one of deep and persistent consecration, distinguished by self-forgetfulness and devotion to the good of others. Next to the loss sustained by the members of her own family will be that suffered by the church with which she has so long been connected. Its services and work were dear to her and no toll was too arduous for its need, no expenditure of time and effort too great for sacrifice. She participated in every good word and work, and only those who have long labored with her can realize what it means to attempt to carry on the work without the inspiration of her presence. Honored and loved by all, she has gone to her rest. As brave at the last as at all times during her life, she manifested that same resourcefulness of self-control and thoughtfulness for others which has been so distinguishing a feature of her life in the presence of great emergencies. She never burdened others with her grief, but in moments of greatest trial gave strength to those who came to sympathize with her. She had no fears, but met death as one who has long been calmly familiar with that mystery of mysteries which beckons us all. Her passing into the unseen was a triumphal march such as I have seldom witnessed. With a word of good cheer spoken to each one, with an unfaltering faith in what awaited her, with a prayer and benediction for all, with the calmness of a child she composed herself for the last sleep.